Chapter 2 of The Tragic Bride. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Tragic Bride by Frances Brett Young. Chapter 2. Her death knocked poor Sir Jocelyn to pieces. Not altogether because he had loved her, but because he had made the habit of depending on her, and happened to be a creature of habits, good or bad. So, having been bereft of that of matrimony, he returned for a time to that of drinking, leaving the child in the spiritual charge of Mr. Considine, a gentleman of small domestic experience, and the physical care of Biddy Joyce, a mother of many. For the time being, Jocelyn was far too busy to bother his head about her, and Biddy dragged her up in the kitchen of Roscarna, where she had suckled her half-brothers before her. Mr. Considine exercising a general supervision, pending the day when her soul should be fit for salvation and ghostly admonition. In the early stages of Jocelyn's relapse, the Parkers of Bagot Street descended on Roscarna in force, a proceeding that Lady Hewish had discountenanced in her lifetime. Neither Jocelyn nor Biddy invited them to stay, and they returned to Dublin scandalized, with the report of Gabrielle, a very small baby of 18 months with coal-black eyes and hair, playing like a kitten with the foot of a dead rabbit on the kitchen floor. "Only to think what poor Laura would have felt," they sighed, not realizing that such a train of thought was in the nature of things unprofitable. So Gabrielle grew, and so, in a few years, Jocelyn, with a tremendous effort, pulled himself together, returning as though refreshed to his sporting pursuits, the woods, the lake and the river. He even found a new hobby, the breeding of cocker spaniels, and worked up an interest in the development of his daughter that ran easily with that of training his puppies. He took a great delight in teasing small animals, and treated Gabrielle and the cockers on much the same lines, with the result that the puppies were usually a little cowed and puzzled when he teased them, but Gabrielle bit his hand. This pleased him, for he set great store by animal spirits in any form, and he carried his fingers bandaged in the hunting field for several weeks, in order that he might tell the story of his daughter's prowess. Jocelyn was growing rather childish in his old age. There were really 3 periods in Gabrielle's early life. The first, before her father began to take notice of her, was spent altogether in the company of Biddy, who embraced her in her general devotion to children. Biddy called herself a Catholic, and for this reason secretly feared and hated the supervision of young Mr. Considine, a priest of the Church of Ireland. But at heart she was as pagan as the top of Slievegullin, and along with her favourite Christian oaths, in one of which Saint Anthony of Padua was disguised as Saint Antonio Perrier, and her whispered Aves, she taught Gabrielle enough pagan mythology and folklore to set her head spinning whenever she found herself alone in the woods or the fields. If ever she strayed into the forbidden lanes beyond the lodge gates at Roscarna, she lived in fear of seeing the dead coach come round the corner, a tall coach, painted black and drawn by coal-black horses, and on the box 2 men, black-coated with black faces, who might jump from the coach and catch her up and throw her inside it. You could never know when the dead coach was coming, for its wheels were bound with old black rags, so that they made no noise on the stones. Then, in the fields where corn was growing one might come across the Limerickon, with consequences untold but terrible. And, above all things, she was never to pick up an old comb in the road, for as like as not the comb would be the property of the Banshee, a little old woman with long nails and hairy arms. When Gabrielle asked what would happen if she picked up the Banshee's comb, Biddy told her that the Banshee would come crying to her window at night, and that if this ever happened, she must get a pair of red-hot tongs and hold the comb in the window for the banshee to take. This seemed to Gabrielle an unnecessary complication, but Biddy told her that if she didn't follow it in every particular, the banshee would scratch the hand off her. Faced with the possibility of this disaster, and not knowing how she could possibly get hold of a pair of red-hot tongs in the middle of the night, Gabrielle decided that if ever she saw a comb in the road, she would not bring it home with her. And this was a wise decision, for the heads of the children in Joyce's country were not above suspicion. Indeed, most of the terrors with which Biddy inspired her were based on principles that were ethically sound and combined romantic color with practical utility. When she was 6, her father began to take her out with him at the time when he exercised the puppies. She and the puppies would run about together and by the same word be called to heel. She found that she could do most of the things that they did. Once, on a summer day when 2 of them had conscientiously frightened a water rat out of its hole on the margin of the lake, Gabrielle, who was far ahead of her father and hot with running, plunged in after them. She got her mouth full of water, and thought she was drowning, and Jocelyn, frightened for her life, ran in after her and rescued her with the water up to his neck. "Now that you're here," he said, "you'd better learn to swim." And he made her, then and there, bring her back to Biddy Joyce like a small drowned cat, with her black hair clinging close to her head. It was a great achievement, and since Biddy could not, for the moment, produce any mythological terror in the nature of a Lorelei better than a pike that preyed on swimmers, Gabrielle would often go down to the lake secretly in the middle of a summer morning, and strip off her clothes and float on her back in the sunshine. She must have looked a strange little thing, with her long white legs, her smooth black hair, her deep violet eyes, and her red lips, for she had this amazing combination of features that you will sometimes find in the far West. She did not get them from her mother or from Jocelyn, both of whom were blonde Saxons. I suppose they came to her through the blood of some Irishwoman whom a dead Hewish had married perhaps 100 years before. While Biddy Joyce instructed her in oaths and legend, and her father taught her to ride, to swim, to shoot, and to fish, her moral and literal education were entrusted to Mr. Considine. Physically, Mr. Considine was of a type that does not change much with the passage of time. When first he came to Roscarna, a couple of years before Gabrielle was born, he was a young man of 20. How he came to be chosen for the cure of Clonderriff I do not know, unless he were in some way connected with the Parker family. He was a Wiltshireman, tall, sandy-haired, with a long face and a square jaw, to which he gave an air of determination by constantly gritting his teeth. Gabrielle, as imitative as a starling, began to mimic this habit of his until one day he found himself staring at her, as at a mirror, and told her to stop. She had meant no harm, she didn't even know that she was doing it, but he treated the offense quite seriously. It was his nature to treat everything seriously, including his mission among the heathen, or, what was worse, the Catholic Joyces. He taught her the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer, and the Collect for the week, and simple fractions and the capes and headlands of England (the capes and headlands of Ireland didn't matter), and the verb to have in French, together with long lists of the kings of Israel and Judah. Gabrielle was very quick to learn. From the first her memory was a pleasant surprise to her, sometimes a surprise to Mr. Considine, as when she offered to give him the kings of Judah backwards, a proceeding that struck him as not only revolutionary but irreverent, and tinged with a flavor of the Black Mass. Gabrielle always knew when she had annoyed or embarrassed him, not because he reproved her in any way to have shown heat in words would have been against his principles but because he did show heat in his neck, where a faint flush would spread upwards to his ears above the band of his clerical collar. When she was thoroughly bored, Gabrielle would sometimes try this experiment, just in the same way as she made the snapdragons put out their tongues. Jocelyn liked Considine and trusted him, partly, no doubt, because he happened to be an Englishman, the only one in this wilderness of Joyces, and partly because he was something of a sportsman, a little too serious and determined for his sport to appear natural, but for all that a good shot over dogs, and a very accurate, if not instinctive, fisherman. In his boyhood, in Wiltshire, he had learned the technique of the dry fly, and his success with trout in gin-clear water made Jocelyn respect him. Considine's friendship with Jocelyn must be put to his credit. If he had been a prig he would either have turned up his nose at his patron's morals, or condoned them with a sense of self-sacrifice and forbearance. He didn't do either. He just took Jocelyn for what he was worth, realizing the shabby trick that heredity had played him, and his attitude toward Gabrielle was much the same. He knew that he couldn't and didn't want to keep pace with her enthusiasms any more than he could keep pace with the baronet's potations. He had been born on a bleak downland, and some of its characteristics had got into the thin, cold humour that was his blood. He was incapable of the generous passions of the people of Roscarna. But I think he was a good man, for all that. Even Mrs. Payne, who had reason to be irritated by his coldness, acknowledged this. And he was as conscientious in his education of Gabrielle as in the care of his parish. The child matured very quickly. Physically, I mean. That is the way in the West. Of course she was a great tomboy, tall for her years, very frank in her speech and totally unconscious of her sex, as free and virginal as the young Artemis. The world of books to which Mr. Considine introduced her in her school hours was wholly forgotten outside them. In the woods and on the mountains she throve as a magnificent young animal, moving with an ease and grace and freedom that civilized woman has lost. Her clothes were of Connemara homespun, but to a body such as hers clothes did not matter. She went barefoot like the girls of Joyce's country, and her ankles were as clean cut as the cannon of a thoroughbred. She wore her black hair in a thick plait that fell below her waist. She had no friends but Biddy, her father and Considine, except a few men, contemporaries of Jocelyn, who joked with her in the hunting field. She knew no women, for ladies did not call at Roscarna, and the county could never forgive her mother's origins in Baggot Street. All her life was uncomplicated and miraculously happy. This Arcadian state of affairs might well have gone on forever, if Jocelyn, feeling that he would like to give her a great treat, and, perhaps, becoming proudly conscious of her beauty, had not determined, in the August of her 16th year, to take her to Dublin for the Horse Show week. She thrilled to the idea, not because she was anxious to meet her own species, but because she loved horses. They travelled up by train from Galway through the vast monotonies of the bog of Allen, and put up at Maple's Hotel in Kildare Street, within 5 minutes' walk of her maternal grandmother's shop. In those days no Irish gentleman would have dreamed of dining in a public room, and they took their meals sedately in a private apartment. Gabrielle had never set foot in a city before. The smooth pavements, the high buildings and the shop windows of Grafton Street excited her. Everything in Dublin wore an air magnificent and spacious. Even the ducks on the pond in the middle of Stephen's Green were exotic, and like no other ducks that she had known. But she could not enjoy her excitement to the full, for the feminine instinct in her realized from the first that her clothes were different from those of the people about her, and this disappointed her, for they were her best, made by the urbane fingers of Monaghan, the tailor at Oughterard. When she walked down Grafton Street she fancied that people stared at her. It never struck her as possible that they were staring at her vivid and unusual beauty. It struck her as funny that her father did not seem to be aware of the discrepancy in her dress. He wasn't in the least. He had taken his daughter for granted. In his unconscious arrogance he imagined that the distinction of being a Hewish of Roscarna was sufficient in itself to make her independent of externals, and as he proposed no alterations she trusted his judgment, and they went to the Horse Show together in their ill-cut tweeds. Gabrielle was entranced by the jumping. Whenever a horse topped the fences she straightened her back automatically, as though she had been riding herself. With such splendid animals as those she felt that she could have made a better job of it. For the moment she forgot all about her questionable clothes, but when, later in the day, she was taken by her father to be presented to the Halbertons, the family of the Devonshire peer with whom the Hewishes were connected, she became immediately and horribly conscious of Lady Halberton's magnificence and the elegance of her daughters. It shocked and thrilled her to see that the elder Halberton girl powdered her nose. She wondered what it must feel like to have one's hands encased in skin-tight gloves, and how these English people managed to speak with such an elegant tiredness. It seemed to her inevitable that Lady Halberton must be ashamed of her cousins, and she was relieved, but a little frightened, to hear this great lady invite her father and her to dinner at the Shelbourne on the following night. After all, she reflected, there must be something in the name of Hewish. She wondered how on earth she could make her father understand that she couldn't very well go to dinner in the dress that she was wearing, the only one that she possessed. Chapter 2. Recording by Roger Moline.